The courtroom was already buzzing when Keanu Reeves stepped inside. The air felt thick, not from heat but from tension. People whispered, heads turning in his direction, some with curiosity, others with disbelief. It wasn't every day that an actor, known worldwide for his roles in movies, walked into a real court dressed in a simple dark suit, his hair neatly tied back. He looked calm, almost too calm, as if the noise around him did not touch him at all. The reason he was here had nothing to do with fame or scandal. He was not defending himself, nor was he here for publicity. Keanu was here because of a promise, one he had made quietly, without telling the press or even his closest friends, a promise to someone who had once helped him in the darkest time of his life. That person could no longer fight for themselves, and now it was his turn to stand up. Across the room sat a man who seemed to control the air around him. He was the lawyer everyone feared, sharp-tongued, arrogant, and known for crushing his opponents not just with legal skill, but with humiliation. His name was Richard Blake. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, flipping through papers like he had already won. To him, this was not just another case. It was a chance to display his power. When his eyes met Keanu's, there was no respect, only a quiet challenge, as if to say, "You don't belong here." Keanu took his seat beside the modest defense attorney he had chosen to assist, a young woman named Claire, who had only been practicing for 3 years. Claire looked nervous. She had been told that facing Richard was like walking into a lion's den with nothing but hope in your hands. But she also knew that Keanu was not here to just sit quietly. He had been studying every detail of this case for months. While the world thought of him as a humble actor, those close to him knew he had a sharp mind and a deep sense of justice. The judge entered and everyone stood. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, marking the start of something no one yet understood would become unforgettable. The opening statements began. Richard was first. He walked with confidence, each step echoing on the polished floor. His words flowed like a practiced performance, each sentence designed to paint his opponent as weak and unprepared. He spoke with a grin that felt almost cruel, throwing glances toward Keanu and Claire, as if daring them to interrupt. When it was Claire's turn, she stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She introduced herself, then hesitated before speaking further. It was at that moment Keanu leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You know the truth. Just tell it." Those words seemed to ground her. She began speaking again, her voice gaining strength with each sentence. But it was clear the judge and the jury were already under Richard's spell. Every time Claire made a point, Richard would laugh softly, shake his head, and mutter something to the person beside him. The jury noticed, and so did Keanu. As the first witness was called, Richard's smirk grew wider. He questioned them with precision, twisting their answers into weapons against the defense. Claire tried to object, but each time, Richard found a way to make her look inexperienced. Then came the moment that made the room hold its breath. During a heated cross-examination, Richard turned to Keanu directly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Mr. Reeves, I know you're used to scripts and stage lights, but in here, we deal with real law, not movie scenes. Are you sure you're in the right place?" A few people in the audience chuckled. Claire froze, unsure whether to speak. Richard's smile widened, waiting for Keanu to back down or say something foolish. But Keanu simply looked at him, calm as a still lake, and replied, "You're right. This isn't a movie. In movies, we get to fix mistakes with a retake. Here, if we let a lie stand, someone's life changes forever. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen." The room went silent. Even the judge paused for a moment before telling them to proceed. Richard laughed, but it was tighter now, like he didn't expect Keanu to answer with such weight. What no one knew yet was that Keanu had been quietly building something, piece by piece, evidence by evidence, that would soon turn the entire trial on its head. The arrogant lawyer thought he had already won, but he had no idea that every smile, Every laugh and every dismissive comment was being watched and remembered. And Keanu, patient as ever, was just waiting for the right moment to move. That moment was coming sooner than anyone thought. His second day of the trial began with a thin mist hanging in the air outside the courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was heavier than the day before. The jury shuffled into their seats, their faces neutral, but Keanu could see it, the faint flicker of curiosity. Maybe it was because of what he had said yesterday. Maybe it was because they sensed something was coming. Richard Blake entered with the same air of confidence as always, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with precision. He glanced at Keanu as though nothing had changed, but his eyes lingered for just a second longer than before. Claire was going over her notes, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Keanu leaned in, speaking softly so only she could hear. "Don't play his game. He wants you to rush, to trip. Stay steady." She nodded, taking a deep breath. The first witness that morning was a man named Thomas Hale, a mid-level manager at the corporation being accused of fraud. He looked uneasy, shifting in his seat as Richard began questioning him. Richard's tone was smooth, almost friendly, guiding Thomas through rehearsed answers that made the company look innocent. But as Keanu watched, he noticed something. A twitch in Thomas's right hand whenever he was asked about specific documents. It wasn't big, but it was there. And then it happened again, when Richard asked about an internal email. Keanu scribbled a note and slid it to Claire. "Ask about the missing invoice, 14th April. When it was Claire's turn, she followed the note. "Mr. Hale, can you tell us why the invoice from April 14th was not included in the financial records submitted to the court?" Thomas hesitated. The room went quiet. Richard immediately stood. "Objection. Irrelevant." The judge looked at Claire. "Counselor, you'll need to explain the relevance." Before Claire could speak, Keanu leaned toward the microphone, his voice low and steady. "Your Honor, that invoice directly connects the shipment in question to funds that were unaccounted for. If it exists, it changes the timeline of the entire case." The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded to Claire. "I'll allow it. Proceed." Thomas's hands shook slightly. I don't recall seeing that invoice." Keanu tilted his head, watching him closely. "Are you sure? Because you signed for it." Richard snapped his head toward Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, you are not the attorney of record here. You can't cross-examine witnesses." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Reeves, you'll direct your comments to Ms. Claire." Keanu gave a small nod, but he had already made his point. Thomas's face had gone pale, and the jury noticed. Throughout the rest of the morning, Claire grew more confident. She started asking sharper questions, guided by Keanu's quiet notes. Richard kept trying to cut her off, but his objections felt more like interruptions now, and the judge seemed less inclined to indulge him. During a recess, Richard approached Keanu in the hallway, his voice low so no one else could hear. "I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't Hollywood. You don't scare me." Keanu looked at him, calm as ever. "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to show the truth. That's something you can't cross-examine away." Richard's jaw tightened. "Truth is what the jury believes, and I'm very good at shaping belief." Keanu's reply was almost a whisper. "We'll see." When court resumed, Claire introduced a small stack of papers, records that the defense had managed to get overnight from a whistleblower. Among them was a photocopy of the missing April 14th invoice. The name Thomas Hale was signed at the bottom. Richard immediately objected, questioning the authenticity, but the judge allowed it to be admitted for review. The jury leaned forward, eyes scanning the page, and for the first time, Richard's smile faltered. He still acted in control, still moved with confidence, but Keanu could see it, the tiniest crack in his armor. It was enough. Keanu knew how people like Richard operated. They built their power on certainty, on the illusion that nothing could touch them. Take away even a fraction of that certainty, and the whole structure could begin to fall. The day ended with murmurs in the gallery, the press scribbling in their notepads. Claire looked at Keanu as they packed up. "We might have just turned this around," she whispered. Keanu shook his head. "Not yet. This was just the first step. The real fight is still ahead." The third day began with a tension so thick it seemed to press down on everyone in the courtroom. Even the judge, usually calm and distant, seemed to sense the undercurrent running through the room. People had heard about the missing invoice. Whispers had spread in the hallways, and now there was a quiet expectation. Something was shifting. Richard Blake still entered with his usual polished confidence, but there was a stiffness in his movements today. He didn't look at Keanu as long this time, but when their eyes did meet, the arrogance was still there, though edged now with a hint of calculation. Claire sat down beside Keanu, flipping through her notes. She spoke in a low voice. "He's going to try to bury us in technicalities today. I can feel it." Keanu nodded. "Then we give him a shovel and let him dig his own hole." Court opened with Richard calling a forensic accountant as his expert witness. The man spoke with authority, his voice steady, explaining how the company's financial records had been reviewed and found to be completely transparent and clean. His tone was designed to reassure the jury, to make them believe that any suggestion of fraud was nonsense. But Keanu listened differently. He listened for what the man didn't say. The expert kept emphasizing the completeness of the records available to him at the time. Those words, "at the time," stood out like a faint crack in glass. Keanu wrote a note for Claire. Ask about scope. Ask what documents were excluded. When Claire questioned the witness, she followed Keanu's note exactly. "Mr. Clark, when you reviewed the financial records, did you have access to all company transactions, including off-site storage archives?" The man hesitated. "No, my review was limited to the records the company provided to me." Claire's voice stayed calm. "So if any records were withheld from you, you wouldn't know?" Richard jumped to his feet. Objection, speculation. But the judge overruled him. "He can answer." The expert shifted uncomfortably. "Correct. If records were withheld, I wouldn't be aware of them." A few members of the jury exchanged looks. Keanu leaned back slightly, his eyes on Richard. He saw it, the faint narrowing of the lawyer's eyes, the tap of a finger against his leg. Richard had realized the direction of the questioning, and he didn't like it. The afternoon session brought a twist no one expected. Claire called a surprise witness, a former junior accountant from the company. She was nervous, her voice trembling as she sat down. She explained how she had been instructed to lose certain invoices, including the one from April 14th. Richard pounced. "Are you saying you personally destroyed company documents?" The woman shook her head quickly. "No. I was told to move them to a separate file off the main record. My supervisor handled the rest." Richard smirked, turning to the jury. "And you expect this court to believe you're telling the truth now, after admitting you participated in this so-called removal?" Before she could answer, Keanu leaned toward Claire and whispered something. Claire nodded. She turned back to the witness. "Ms. Lewis, you brought something with you today, didn't you?" The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. "This has scanned copies of the invoices I moved. I kept them, just in case." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Richard's face darkened instantly. "Objection!" he barked. "We have not been given these files." The judge cut him off. "Then you'll have the opportunity to review them. They will be submitted into evidence." Keanu watched Richard carefully. The man was still trying to hold his composure, but the crack was widening. As the day ended, Claire packed her bag with a newfound steadiness. "We've got him, haven't we?" she asked quietly. Keanu shook his head. Almost. But a cornered opponent is dangerous. Tomorrow he'll fight harder than ever. And Keanu knew Richard wouldn't just try to win. He'd try to destroy them completely before the jury could make up their minds. What Richard didn't know was that Keanu had been planning for that exact moment. The fourth day began with heavy rain outside, the kind that made the courthouse steps slick and the air smell of wet stone. Inside, the atmosphere was sharper, almost electric. Everyone could sense it. Today would not be like the other days. Richard Blake walked in earlier than usual, his suit immaculate, his briefcase snapping open like a soldier unsheathing a weapon. He didn't look at Keanu right away. Instead, he walked straight to the prosecution table, spread out a series of thick folders, and spoke quietly to his assistants. There was an urgency in his movements now. Keanu arrived moments later with Claire, both of them calm but alert. Claire glanced at Richard's table and whispered, "He's going to hit us with something big." Keanu gave the smallest of smiles. Good. That means we're close to the truth. The judge called the court to order, and Richard was on his feet before anyone else. Your Honor, the prosecution wishes to introduce new evidence that calls into question the credibility of the defense's witness, Ms. Lewis. The bailiff carried over a file, thick with printed emails and reports. Richard's voice was smooth as he explained that these were internal company communications, suggesting Ms. Lewis had been reprimanded for falsifying numbers in the past. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Claire's face tightened, but before she could respond, Keanu leaned over and whispered, "Let him play it all out." Richard went on, reading selectively from the documents, painting Miss Lewis as a disgruntled ex-employee trying to take revenge. His delivery was theatrical, pausing at the right moments, giving the jury time to absorb his words. By the end, several jurors looked uneasy. When it was Claire's turn, she stood slowly, her voice even. "Mr. Blake, these emails you just submitted, could you read the dates aloud for the court?" Richard hesitated. "The dates are in the document." "Humor me," Claire said, keeping her eyes steady on him. Richard flipped through the pages. "April 12th, April 15th, Claire interrupted. "April 15th? The day after the missing invoice was created?" Keanu saw it, the slight twitch in Richard's jaw. Claire continued. "And in these emails, who is the sender?" Richard cleared his throat. "The sender is Daniel Clark. The same Daniel Clark who was the company's chief financial officer at the time?" Richard's voice was quieter now. "Yes." Claire took a step closer to the jury. "And is it true that Mr. Clark resigned under investigation for unrelated financial misconduct 6 months later?" Richard objected immediately, but the judge allowed the question. Richard's yes sounded more like a defeat than an answer. Then Claire delivered the blow. "Your Honor, we will present phone records showing that on April 14th, the day the invoice was created, Mr. Clark called Mr. Blake's office directly, twice, for over 15 minutes each time." The room froze. Richard's face stayed still, but the tension in his hands betrayed him. The judge ordered the phone records to be entered into evidence. The gallery erupted into low murmurs. During the lunch break, Richard approached Keanu in the hallway, his voice tight but controlled. "You think you're clever, but I've been doing this long before you ever thought of stepping into a courtroom." Keanu looked at him steadily. "And yet here we are. You, scrambling. Me, still calm." Richard leaned in. "You don't scare me." Keanu's reply was soft, but it cut like glass. "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to end this." The afternoon was worse for Richard. Claire introduced testimony from another whistleblower, a former assistant to the CFO, who confirmed that documents had been altered under Richard's direction before they were turned over in earlier proceedings. Richard fought hard, objecting repeatedly, trying to cast doubt, but the weight of the evidence was starting to crush his narrative. The jury leaned forward, listening to every word. By the end of the day, Richard's polished confidence had dulled. His eyes no longer swept the courtroom like a ruler surveying his kingdom. They flicked toward the jury, toward Keanu, toward the stack of evidence growing against him. As they left the courthouse, Claire whispered, "Tomorrow might be the end." Keanu glanced back at the building, the rain now just a fine mist in the air. "Tomorrow, we close the trap." The fifth day dawned with a gray sky, the kind that seemed to press low over the city, making the courthouse look older and heavier than ever. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, like the air before a storm breaks. The gallery was full, reporters, curious locals, and a handful of quiet faces who had been there every day, watching. Richard Blake arrived early, his suit crisp, his smile forced but still present. He carried only a slim folder this time, not the mountain of paperwork he'd brought on previous days. It was a subtle signal. He was conserving his energy for a final push. Keanu and Claire entered together, calm as ever. Claire's steps were steadier now, her voice when greeting the bailiff carrying a quiet confidence. She had grown in this courtroom, and she knew it. As the judge called the court to order, Richard rose to deliver what he clearly thought would be his moment to regain control. He began a dramatic cross-examination of Mrs. Lewis, hammering her on small inconsistencies in her earlier testimony, twisting her words into knots. But Keanu was ready for it. He had spent most of the night reviewing the flash drive Ms. Lewis had provided, every file, every timestamp. He had found something, a detail so small most would have missed it. He slid a note to Claire. File metadata, invoice scanned 2 hours before loss. When Claire's turn came, she went straight for it. "Ms. Lewis, can you confirm the time you scanned the April 14th invoice?" Ms. Lewis nodded. "Yes, 9:12 a.m. Claire held up a printed screenshot from the flash drive's metadata. "And the company's internal report claims the document went missing at 11:30 a.m. that same day. Is that correct?" The witness confirmed. Claire turned to the jury. "Which means the document existed in its original form for at least 2 hours after being recorded and could not have been lost accidentally. It had to be removed intentionally." Richard objected, but his voice lacked the sharp confidence it once had. The judge overruled. The morning session ended with that point hanging in the air like an unspoken verdict. After lunch, it was Keanu's turn to speak directly, not as an attorney but as a sworn witness. He had been reluctant to step into that role, but the timing was right. He walked to the witness stand with the same calm he had carried all week. When sworn in, he told the court how he had been approached months ago by the family of a man who had lost everything because of the company's fraud. He described how he had quietly studied the case, meeting with experts, going through records, piecing together a picture that no one wanted to see. Richard tried to rattle him. "Mr. Reeves, you have no legal training, correct?" "Correct," Keanu said evenly. "Then why should the jury believe anything you say about company records or legal matters?" Keanu looked at the jury, his voice steady but carrying weight. "Because I'm not here to win. I'm here to tell the truth. And the truth doesn't need a law degree to be seen. It just needs to be shown." The room went still. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Claire introduced the phone records from the day of the invoice, showing calls between the CFO's office and Richard's firm. When the judge allowed them into evidence, the jurors leaned in, scanning the times. Claire followed with a question that landed like a hammer. "Mr. Blake, can you explain why your office spoke twice for over 15 minutes each time, with the CFO's direct line on the exact day the invoice was removed from company records?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. His polished composure faltered for the first time. "No further questions," Claire said, and sat down. By the time court adjourned, the gallery was buzzing. Some people smiled faintly at Keanu as he left. Others whispered to each other, glancing at Richard, whose confident stride was now slower, heavier. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. Keanu paused on the courthouse steps, looking back at the doors. "Tomorrow," he said quietly to Claire, "we finish it." The sixth day of the trial began with sunlight breaking through the clouds, casting sharp beams through the tall courthouse windows. It was as if the weather itself knew something was about to end. Inside, the air felt different, more watchful, more expectant. The jury members sat straighter. The gallery was silent, waiting. Richard Blake entered with his head high, his suit perfect, but the strain showed in the faint lines around his eyes. He carried only a single sheet of paper in his hand. It was a desperate move, either a last piece of evidence or a final attempt at control. Keanu and Claire arrived together, their expressions calm, almost serene. Claire's grip on her folder was steady now, her voice soft but certain when she greeted the bailiff. The judge opened the day's proceedings, and Richard was the first to stand. "Your Honor," he began, "I have here an affidavit from the company's former security director claiming the April 14th invoice was a fabrication created by the defense." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Richard handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge, but Keanu didn't flinch. He leaned over to Claire and whispered, "This is his last card. Wait for it to crumble." Claire rose. "Your Honor, the defense asks that the witness who provided this affidavit be present for cross-examination before the jury considers it." The judge agreed and called for the witness. Minutes later, the former security director entered, nervous, avoiding eye contact. Under questioning, it took less than 5 minutes for the truth to surface. The affidavit had been signed only yesterday, after the company promised the man a consulting fee for his cooperation. When confronted with his own emails, in which he admitted seeing the original invoice, the witness's voice faltered. Richard objected, tried to shift the focus, but the damage was done. Then came Claire's closing argument. She didn't rush. She walked slowly toward the jury, her voice even but carrying the weight of the past week. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the evidence. You've heard how documents were moved, hidden, and erased. You've seen phone records linking the very people who claimed ignorance to the exact moment the fraud was covered up. And you've watched as those who tried to tell the truth were attacked instead of heard." She paused, glancing briefly at Keanu. "This case is not about a piece of paper. It's about whether the powerful can twist the truth until it disappears. You hold the answer." Richard's closing was sharp, polished, but lacked the spark it once had. The cracks in his armor had become too visible. The jury left to deliberate. The wait was long, 3 hours that felt like an eternity. Keanu sat still, his hands folded, his gaze steady on the jury door. When the jurors returned, their foreperson stood. "We find in favor of the defense." The words seemed to hang in the air before the gallery erupted. Claire exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the table. Keanu closed his eyes for a brief second, then looked over at Richard. Richard's face was blank, but his eyes burned. He gathered his papers without a word and left the courtroom, his once confident stride now slow, his shoulders heavier. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were flooded with reporters. Microphones were pushed forward, questions fired in rapid bursts. Keanu raised a hand for quiet. "This was never about winning," he said. "It was about making sure the truth had a voice. Today it did." He turned, offering his arm to Claire, and together they walked down the steps into the bright afternoon sun. Somewhere in the crowd, the family of the man Keanu had promised to help was watching, tears in their eyes. Keanu met their gaze and gave a small nod. Promise kept. And as the city moved on with its noise and rush, the story of the arrogant lawyer who laughed at Keanu Reeves in court and then lost would become something whispered with respect for years to come.